On the afternoon of December 9, 1914, along a frozen stretch of ground in Flanders, Belgium, something happened that had never happened before in the history of modern warfare, and has never quite happened since. German and British soldiers, who had spent weeks trying to kill each other from opposing trenches, climbed out of the mud, walked toward each other across no man's land, and kicked a football. No orders were given. No treaty was signed. No general authorized it. Just a ball. And the instinct, shared across enemy lines, across languages, across everything that war had built to divide them, to play. That moment, buried inside the catastrophe of World War I, tells you something that no history book about football ever quite says directly. This game does not just entertain people. It reaches something older than nations, older than armies, older than the borders drawn on maps. So how did a simple act of kicking a ball become the most popular game in human history? How did it travel from muddy English school fields to every continent on Earth? How did it become the one thing that could stop a war, even briefly, even impossibly? That answer starts long before England. Long before the rules were written. Long before anyone called it football at all. In 1004 BC, records from the Chinese imperial court describe a game called Cuju, which translates roughly to kick the ball with the foot. Players competed on a rectangular field, attempting to kick a leather ball stuffed with feathers and hair through a small opening in a silk net stretched between two bamboo poles. The game was not casual recreation. It was practiced by military soldiers as physical conditioning and later adopted by the imperial court as entertainment. Historical texts record that Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty was an enthusiastic player. Women played it. Children played it. It spread across social classes in a way that almost nothing else in ancient China did. And China was not alone. In ancient Japan, a ceremonial game called Kamari was played in the courtyards of the imperial palace. Players stood in a circle and kept a deerskin ball airborne using only their feet, knees, and shoulders. There was no opponent. No score. No winner. The entire purpose was collective skill, keeping the ball in the air together for as long as possible. In the Americas, the ancient Maya and Aztec civilizations played a ritual ball game on stone courts, some of which still stand across Mexico and Central America. The ball was solid rubber, and the game carried religious significance so profound that some accounts suggest losing teams were sacrificed. Whether the players or the winners were sacrificed remains historically debated, but the point is clear. This was not recreation. This was ceremony. In ancient Greece and Rome, versions of ball games involving feet appear in artwork and written accounts. The Romans played a game called harpastum, a rough and frequently violent competition involving a small hard ball and almost no restrictions on physical contact. Across every continent, across thousands of years, humans kept independently arriving at the same idea. A ball. 2 feet. A goal worth fighting for. The specific rules differed. The cultural meaning differed. But the instinct was identical. If you had wandered into an English village in the 12th century on Shrove Tuesday, you would have witnessed something that looked less like sport and more like a controlled riot. The entire village played. Hundreds of people. Men, women, sometimes children. 2 teams representing different parishes or different ends of town. The goal was to carry or kick an inflated pig's bladder to a target at the opposing end of the village, which might be a church door, a town square, or simply a marker miles away in the countryside. There were essentially no rules. You could punch, tackle, drag, wrestle, or run. Streets were the pitch. Gardens, rivers, and market stalls were acceptable terrain. Injuries were common. Deaths were not unheard of. This was mob football, and it terrified authorities for centuries. In 1314, King Edward II of England issued a formal proclamation banning football in the City of London, describing it as a game in which there is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls, from which many evils might arise. It did not work. Edward III banned it. Henry IV banned it. Henry VIII banned it. James I of Scotland banned it. The game was suppressed, fined, outlawed, and condemned from pulpits across the country for over 400 years. And the people kept playing. Because you cannot legislate away an instinct that deep. If this history is the kind of content that makes you want to keep learning, subscribe to the channel right now. We cover the stories behind the things the world takes for granted, and there are a lot more of them. By the early 19th century, football in England had split into chaos. Every school, every town, every region played by different rules. At rugby school, players could pick up the ball and run with it. At Eton, only feet were allowed. At some schools, tripping was permitted. At others, it was grounds for expulsion. When students from different schools arrived at the same university, particularly Cambridge, they discovered they could not play together. They literally did not share enough rules to organize a match. In 1848, a group of Cambridge students sat down and attempted to write the first unified set of football rules. The document became known as the Cambridge Rules, and while it was not perfect or universally adopted, it was the first serious attempt to turn a chaotic folk tradition into a codified sport. But the real turning point came 15 years later. On October 26, 1863, representatives from 12 London football clubs met at a pub called the Freemasons' Tavern in central London. Their purpose was to establish a single governing body and a single set of rules that all clubs would follow. They founded the Football Association. And then the arguments started. The most bitter dispute was over what became known as hacking. This was the practice of kicking an opponent in the shins to bring them down. Several clubs considered it essential to the game, believing that removing it would make football soft. One representative argued, with remarkable passion, that banning hacking would do away with all the courage and pluck of the game. The Football Association voted to ban it anyway. The clubs that refused to accept the new rules walked out of the meeting. They eventually formed their own organization around a different set of rules that permitted handling the ball and tackling by hand. They called their game rugby football. And the version left behind, the one with only feet, was gradually just called football. 2 codes. 1 argument. One night in a pub in London. And the sporting world was divided into 2 separate rivers that have never rejoined. Here is the thing that surprises people when they first learn it. Football did not spread through government programs or organized campaigns. Nobody sat in an office and decided to export it. It traveled the way fire travels, by contact, by accident, by human enthusiasm that could not be contained. British sailors carried it into port cities. British engineers building railways in South America kicked a ball around during lunch breaks. British teachers in European schools organized matches between their students. British workers in textile factories in Spain, Argentina, and Brazil played in the streets after their shifts ended. And everywhere it landed, it took root instantly. In 1867, the first football club outside Britain was founded in Buenos Aires, Argentina, by British expatriates. Within 20 years, local Argentinians were forming their own clubs, developing their own style, and competing in their own leagues. In Brazil, a young man named Charles Miller returned from his education in England in 1894 carrying 2 footballs and a rulebook. He organized the first formal match in Sao Paulo. Within a decade, football was the dominant sport in the country. In Spain, British miners working in Bilbao helped found what would eventually become Athletic Club, one of the oldest clubs in Spanish football. British workers in the port of Huelva helped establish the Spanish game in the south. The pattern repeated across Europe, across South America, across Africa, across Asia. What made football spread faster than any other sport in history was not complexity. It was simplicity. You needed a ball. You needed open ground. You needed people willing to run. That combination was available in every village on Earth. A sport that required expensive equipment, complex infrastructure, or detailed knowledge of rules would have stayed British. Football required almost nothing, and it went everywhere. By the 1920s, football had become genuinely global. Clubs existed on 6 continents. International matches were drawing enormous crowds. The 1924 Olympic Games in Paris featured a football tournament that packed 40,000 people into stadiums to watch teams from Uruguay, Switzerland, and Sweden compete. The Frenchman Jules Rimet, president of the international football governing body FIFA, had a vision. A tournament. Every nation invited. A genuine world championship. The first FIFA World Cup was held in Uruguay in 1930. Uruguay was chosen for 2 reasons. First, they were the reigning Olympic champions. Second, they agreed to fund the entire tournament themselves and compensate visiting teams for their travel expenses. 13 nations participated. Europe sent only 4 teams, largely because the journey by ship took several weeks and the cost was prohibitive. Uruguay won the final against Argentina 4-2 in front of an estimated 93,000 people in Montevideo. And something became clear that day in that stadium. Football was not just a game anymore. It was the thing that nations used to measure themselves against each other. A World Cup match was not sport. It was identity, compressed into 90 minutes. Every era of football produced individuals whose names crossed language barriers and reached people who had never seen a football match in their lives. Pele. Born Edson Arantes do Nascimento in a small Brazilian town in 1940. His family was so poor his father once broke down in tears because he could not afford to buy his son a proper football. Pele grew up kicking stuffed socks through the streets. He made his debut for the Brazilian national team at 17. He won his first World Cup at 17. By the time he retired, he had scored over 1,000 goals by official count, a number so extraordinary that FIFA issued a formal statement questioning whether it was even real. It was real. Johan Cruyff. The Dutch genius who invented an entirely new philosophy of football in the 1970s, a system called total football, in which every player on the field was expected to be capable of playing every position. Fluid, intelligent, relentless. Cruyff's Netherlands team reached the 1974 World Cup final playing football so beautiful that the tournament is still remembered primarily for the team that lost it. Diego Maradona. Argentina. 1986 World Cup. Quarter-final against England. 5 years after the Falklands War. 2 goals in one match that encapsulated everything football can be, the worst and the best of it, simultaneously. The first goal, scored with his hand, which he described afterward as scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The second goal, 4 minutes later, in which he received the ball inside his own half, turned past one English player, accelerated past another, drifted around a third, drew the goalkeeper, and slid the ball into the net, covering 60 meters in 11 seconds, leaving 6 defenders behind him. The BBC called it the goal of the century. They still call it that. Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. 2 players, different in almost every measurable way, who dominated the sport simultaneously for nearly 20 years, forcing every generation of football fans to choose a side in a debate that has no correct answer and will never end. Their rivalry did not damage football. It elevated it. Every generation needs something to argue about. They gave the world an argument worth having. In 1992, the top English clubs broke away from the existing Football League structure and formed the Premier League, negotiating their own television rights deal independently. The initial deal was worth £305 million over 5 years. The current Premier League television rights are valued at approximately £10 billion per cycle. Football had become an industry so large it functioned like a separate economy. Transfer fees for individual players crossed £100 million. Then £200 million. A single footballer's weekly wage exceeded the annual salary of most surgeons. The 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar was watched by an estimated 5 billion people across the planet. That is roughly 60% of every living human being. No other cultural event in human history has ever reached that number. And yet, for all its glory, football has never been clean. Corruption within FIFA ran so deep that in 2015, the United States Department of Justice indicted 14 FIFA officials on charges including racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. The total amount of bribery involved was estimated at over $150 million. The president of FIFA, Sepp Blatter, resigned. His successor was banned from football for 6 years. Prosecutors described the organization as a criminal enterprise that had operated for decades behind the cover of global sport. Then there was racism. Black players subjected to monkey chants in stadiums across Europe. Players walking off pitches in protest. Governing bodies issuing fine penalties so small they amounted to permission slips. Then there was the Super League proposal of 2021. 12 of Europe's wealthiest clubs, including Manchester United, Real Madrid, and Juventus, announced plans to form a closed competition accessible only to founding members regardless of performance. Promotion and relegation, the fundamental principle that any club can rise and any club can fall through merit, would be abolished. The backlash was so immediate and so total that within 48 hours, 9 of the 12 clubs had withdrawn. Fans stood outside stadiums holding signs. Players spoke against it publicly. The entire idea collapsed in less than 3 days. Football has always had an immune system. And when something threatens what the game actually is, the people who love it tend to reject it. Return to that frozen field in Belgium. December 1914. The soldiers who climbed out of the trenches that day had no authority to do what they did. They were violating military protocol. Their officers could have ordered them back. Some officers joined them instead. They exchanged cigarettes. They showed each other photographs of their families. And they played football. Historians debate exactly how many unofficial truces occurred along the Western Front that Christmas. The number was likely in the dozens. The football matches were real. Contemporary letters and diaries from soldiers on both sides describe them in detail. One British soldier wrote home describing the match, noting that the Germans won 2-1, and adding that he could not help feeling that it was a damned queer way to spend Christmas. It was queer. It was also the most human thing that happened in the entire war. Because football has always done that. Reached past the categories people use to separate each other and found something underneath that doesn't need translation. You do not need to speak the same language to understand what it means when the ball hits the net. You do not need to share a history, a religion, or a political system. You just need to know the game. And everyone knows the game. From a Chinese soldier kicking a feather-stuffed ball in 1004 BC, to a prehistoric ritual in a Maya stone court, to a pub in London where 12 men argued about shin-kicking, to a frozen field in Belgium where enemies became briefly human, to 5 billion people watching a World Cup final simultaneously. That is the line. Unbroken. Running through every century, every continent, every language. Football did not unite the world because it was designed to. It united the world because it asked almost nothing of you. No money. No equipment. No special knowledge. Just the willingness to play. And that has always been enough. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which moment in football history surprised you most. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the stories behind the things the world takes for granted, hit the like button so we know to keep making them.